like to call to order the special called meeting of the Mecklenburg County School Board. Madam Clerk, may I have a roll call, please?
Mr. Sturtevant,
Present.
Mrs. Bailey,
Present.
Mr. Palmer, Mr. Honeycutt,
Present.
Mr. Campbell is absent, Mrs. Garner,
Present.
Mr. Johnson,
Present.
Mr. Edwards,
Present.
Mr. Ritchie,
Present. May I have a motion that we adopt tonight's agenda?
So moved. Second.
I have a motion from Mr. Honeycutt, seconded by Mr. Palmer. Roll call, please.
Mr. Sturtevant.
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey.
Yes.
Mr. Palmer.
Yes.
Mr. Honeycutt.
Yes.
Mrs. Garner.
Yes.
Mr. Johnson.
Yes.
Mr. Edwards.
Yes.
Mr. Ritchie.
Yes. All right, now do we need to go into closed session now? The agenda doesn't have the statement on it about going into closed session.
Yes.
It's there, isn't it? Yeah.
Here, we have it from, I got it, thank you. May I have a motion that the school board convenes a closed meeting for personnel matters regarding resignations, retirements, supplements, adjustments, employments, grievances, and discipline pursuant to the Code of Virginia, Section 2.23711A1, and student matters regarding out-of-attendance zone and non-resident students pursuant to the Code of Virginia 2.23711A2.
So moved. Second.
I got a motion from Mr. Edwards, seconded by Mr. Honeycutt. Roll call, please.
Mr. Sturtevant.
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey.
Yes.
Mr. Palmer.
Yes.
Mr. Honeycutt.
Yes.
Mrs. Garner.
Yes.
Mr. Johnson.
Yes.
Mr. Edwards.
Yes.
Mr. Ritchie.
Yes. All right, now in closed session, and that the board certifies that to the best of each member's knowledge, only public business matters lawfully exempted from the open meeting to which this certification applies, and only such business matters as were identified in the motion concerning the closed meeting were heard, discussed, or considered.
So moved.
Second. Motion from Mr. Honeycutt, seconded by Mr. Johnson. Roll call, please.
Mr. Sturtevant.
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey.
Yes.
Mr. Palmer.
Yes.
Mr. Honeycutt.
Yes.
Mrs. Garner.
Yes.
Mr. Johnson.
Yes.
Mr. Edwards.
Yes.
Mr. Ritchie.
Yes. All right, we're back in open session. To our action items, we might as well take these in order. It won't take but a minute. May I have a motion that the school board approves the personnel recommendations?
So moved.
Second.
I have a motion from Mr. Honeycutt, seconded by Ms. Garner. Roll call, please.
Mr. Sturtevant.
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey.
Yes.
Mr. Palmer.
Yes.
Mr. Honeycutt.
Yes.
Mrs. Garner.
Yes.
Mr. Johnson.
Yes.
Mr. Edwards.
Yes, with exception.
Mr. Ritchie.
Yes. May I have a motion that the school board approves the additional personnel recommendation?
So moved.
Second.
I have a motion from Ms. Garner, seconded by Mr. Johnson. Roll call, please.
Mr. Sturtevant.
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey.
Yes.
Mr. Palmer.
Yes.
Mr. Honeycutt.
Yes.
Mrs. Garner.
Yes.
Mr. Johnson.
Yes.
Mr. Edwards.
Yes.
Mr. Ritchie.
Yes. Now, in regards to student matter 20182019002, do I have a motion that the school board approves the creation of additional classes to accommodate the increase in enrollment at La Crosse Elementary?
So moved. Second.
I have a motion from Mr. Palmer, seconded by Mr. Edwards. Roll call, please.
Mr. Sturtevant.
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey.
Yes.
Mr. Palmer.
Yes.
Mr. Honeycutt.
Yes.
Mrs. Garner.
Yes.
Mr. Johnson.
Yes.
Mr. Edwards.
Yes.
Mr. Ritchie.
Yes. Is there any discussion that you want to have before we adjourn?
I think the situation is pretty clear. We're going to be creating new classroom space. The children will be in a position to come back to La Crosse Elementary School.
May I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All right.